by James R. Grossman. Where Opportunity Awaits by James R. Grossman. Paintings by Jacob Lawrence. Genre. Expository text tells the nature of a true event. In addition to what you will read, notice the visual information that helps to inform you about the Great Migration. The Thomas family arrived in Chicago in the spring of 1917. Like thousands of other black Southerners moving north, they first had to find a home. For a week, they pounded the pavements of the city's South Side. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, their 19-year-old daughter, and 17-year-old son eventually crowded into a 5-room apartment. It was cramped, but probably larger than the farmhouse they had left behind in Alabama. Their second task was to find work. The men went to the stockyards, and the women earned money doing laundry. Painting by Optimistic about the future, the teenagers spent their evenings at night school, hoping to improve on the grade school education they had earned in a rural southern schoolhouse. In their free time, the family explored the leisure activities available on Chicago's South Side, carrying picnics into the park, and venturing into theaters and ice cream parlors. The Thomases were part of the first Great Migration, the collective journeys of 500,000 black Southerners to northern cities between 1916 and 1919. By 1918, migration chains that linked south to north enabled thousands of Southerners to choose destinations where they had friends or relatives to offer a welcoming hand. A native of Abbeville, South Carolina, for example, could move to Philadelphia without worrying about where she might sleep the first night in town. From Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a newcomer could easily find the Hattiesburg Barber Shop in Chicago and be directed to the appropriate boarding house. In most cases, these patterns conformed largely to patterns established by railroad routes. North and South Carolinians went to New York, Philadelphia, and other eastern seaboard cities. Pittsburgh's African-American newcomers were likely to hail from Alabama, Georgia, or Kentucky. From Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and parts of Georgia and Alabama, people headed for Chicago. Because of the influence of the Chicago Defender newspaper and the long tentacles of the Illinois Central Railroad, Chicago was an especially popular destination. The chains allowed prospective migrants to make arrangements before leaving home. Let me know what day you expect to leave and over what road, and if I don't meet you, I will have someone there to meet you and look after you until I see you, one woman wrote from Chicago to a member of her former church in Mississippi. These kinds of community and family contacts had tied southern cities to their hinterlands for decades. They now extended north. A thin strand even stretched west from Texas and Oklahoma to the west coast. Because these migrants arrived during a wartime housing shortage, most encountered difficulty finding a place to live. Usually, a black northerner in 1920 was likely to have at least several white neighbors within a few blocks. But by 1930, that likelihood had diminished considerably, with African Americans segregated into ghettos. Ghettos, however, were not necessarily slums. Property values have not always declined as neighborhoods shift from white to black. During the Great Migration and throughout much of the 1900s, the process was complicated. As Southerners, most of them poor and unaccustomed to urban life, moved into the least expensive and oldest neighborhoods, established residents tended to seek better housing in less crowded districts. But housing discrimination meant that black neighborhoods could expand only slowly and only at their edges. Black Northerners generally paid more than whites would pay for similar living space. At the same time, black workers earned less than their white counterparts. Hence, African Americans spent a very high percentage of their income on shelter. In some cases, this left homeowners without sufficient funds to maintain their houses adequately. In New York City's Harlem, rents generally commanded nearly half of the earnings of African. Painting by Jacob Lawrence, American Residents. Naturally, this placed a considerable burden on family resources. In addition, because there was a constant need for housing, landlords collected rents more diligently than they maintained their buildings. Tenants who demanded proper maintenance, and many did, could usually be replaced with newcomers who knew little about what to expect or who took what they could get because they had few choices. Gradually, the turnover of residents and the deterioration of buildings due to overcrowding and shoddy construction methods took its toll on the surrounding block. As a result, the neighborhood declined. During World War I, and at times during the 1920s, black newcomers found places to work in northern cities much more easily than they found places to live. In fact, the first Great Migration was stimulated by the opening of thousands of new railroad jobs. By 1917, African Americans were also working in heavy industry across the Northeast and Midwest. Most of the jobs in steel mills, auto plants, packing houses, and rubber factories could be learned quickly. It was far more difficult for many migrants from the South to adapt to a different approach to time. They were not, however, the only ones who faced this difficulty. Rural workers around the world had faced the same difficulty when introduced to industrial employment. In the rural South, just as in other agricultural societies, the calendar and the weather determined the work pace. One planter described cotton cultivation as a series of spurts rather than a daily grind. In those areas where Southern workers did not have to sustain a regular pace, railroad tie layers, dock hands, construction gangs, for example, a work song set the rhythm. These songs were flexible. A song leader who set the tempo could change the pace. By the 1910s, most workers in northern factories were punching time clocks. Arrive 10 minutes late, and your pay was docked 1 hour. On the disassembly lines of the packing houses, conveyor belts moved animal carcasses from worker to worker, each of whom would make a single cut. Tardiness or absence could disrupt the whole process. Once a line began moving, a newcomer had no control over the pace of work. Painting by Jacob Lawrence. The Migration of the Negro, panel number. What did not require adjustment, however, was hard work. I will and can do any kind of work, declared one man just before heading north from his Florida home. Men with farm experience were accustomed to a workday that began at dawn and ended at sundown. Black women, responsible in both rural and urban settings for household labor as well as for producing income, began their work earlier and ended later. I came here to Philadelphia because people said it was better, recalled Ella Lee of her early years in Philadelphia. So much better living in the North than it was in the South. But so far as I am concerned, you have got to work like a dog to have anything anywhere you go. The difference for most migrants, the reason why most not only stayed but also encouraged their friends and relatives to join them, was that the hard work produced rewards during the war years and in the 1920s. In interviews and in letters back home, migrants spoke enthusiastically of sending their children to school, voting, sitting where they pleased on streetcars, and countless other accomplishments. Although black women in the North were pushed out of industry and into domestic employment after World War I, even domestic service paid better in the North than in the South. Black men retained their industrial footholds, putting more cash in their pay envelopes and looking forward to the possibility of promotions down the road.